What if the empire you built, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, was thriving on a secret you were never meant to discover? What if the very people you trusted most were quietly bleeding your legacy dry, turning a blind eye to suffering for the sake of profit? Eleanor Carter had everything: power, wealth, control. But beneath that shimmering surface lay a question so dangerous it could destroy everything she'd ever built. When Eleanor discovered whispers of corruption within her company, Carter Apparel, the fashion titan her father built from the ground up, she stood at a crossroads. She could stay silent, preserve her dynasty, and continue living in her insulated world. Or she could burn it all down in pursuit of the truth. But here's the real dilemma. When you challenge the powerful, even if you win, what do you lose? Eleanor Carter was no stranger to attention. With her sharp intellect, commanding presence, and a tailored elegance that masked the fire beneath, she moved through the corporate world like a queen surveying her kingdom. To the media, she was the golden standard, a visionary who balanced compassion with cunning, running one of the most successful ethical fashion companies in the country. Her interviews were quoted, her image spotless. But behind closed doors, that image had begun to crack. Lately, a restlessness gnawed at her, not the usual stress of board meetings or the grinding demands of shareholders, but something deeper, a disquiet she couldn't name. Were the values she preached truly being upheld within the company's walls? Whispers had reached her ears, muffled complaints from a factory in the Midwest, pay cuts, reduced hours, unjust practices. Each time she brought up these concerns, her top executives assured her all was well. Their voices were steady, too steady, their answers rehearsed, like actors reading lines from a script they'd memorized long ago. And though she tried to convince herself otherwise, something about their smooth reassurances chilled her. She leaned back from her polished mahogany desk, staring past the glass walls of her penthouse office. The city glittered beneath her, a skyline she'd conquered, and yet she felt miles away from it all. Her personal life had dwindled to boardrooms and deadlines, relationships faded, laughter now a memory, and even in solitude she couldn't escape the constant pulse of responsibility. Success had become a fortress, but also a cage. That evening she poured herself a glass of Pinot Noir and sat silently at her dining table. Before her lay a confidential document, anonymous but undeniably real, a whistleblower's report, pages of names, workers, human beings, each with notes detailing sudden reductions in hours, unexplained pay slashes, some slight, others severe. And the most haunting part? This wasn't a one-off. This was systemic. Her fingers tightened around the glass stem. Her heart pounded with betrayal, fear, and an anger she didn't know how to name. She had two choices: rely on the people she'd once trusted, or reclaim the truth with her own hands. And Eleanor had never been the type to sit and be spoon-fed lies. Her father, a man of grit and vision, had taught her that leadership meant walking every floor, knowing every name, understanding every corner of your business, no matter how dirty. And so, an idea took root, reckless, wild, but necessary. She would go undercover. No press, no investigations, just her. Stripped of her title, stripped of her name, just another face in the crowd. The next morning, she made a discreet call to a longtime friend in HR, someone who owed her a favor and knew how to keep a secret. By the end of the week, she had a new identity: Emma Clark. A fabricated resume, a simple background. Nothing to raise flags, just another cog in the machine. 7 days later, Eleanor, now Emma, stood outside the factory's gates, dressed in a plain blue uniform, her hair pulled back in a low, functional ponytail. No designer shoes, no chauffeur. Just gravel under her feet and an unfamiliar weight in her chest. The cool morning air felt different here. Dense, sharp, unwelcoming. Inside, the factory was a world apart. The heavy scent of oil, dust, and something else lingered in the air, something harder to name. Maybe it was fear or resignation. The atmosphere pressed against her, invisible but suffocating. She adjusted the stiff collar of her uniform and glanced at the name tag, Emma Clark. No history, no status, no shield. She was just one of many now. The room buzzed with the rhythmic hum of sewing machines. Dozens of workers bent over fabric, their movements mechanical, robotic. No chatter, no laughter, just the occasional scrape of a chair or a cough breaking the monotony. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was haunted. The kind of silence that screams louder than words. Her eyes scanned the room, fluorescent lights flickering above, faded safety signs curling off the walls, and massive fans doing little to ease the stifling heat. But it wasn't the discomfort that hit her hardest. It was the fear. The way everyone kept their heads down, like the air itself could punish them. Then it came. A voice, sharp, commanding, cut through the silence like a whip. "Eyes on your work, not the walls." Eleanor's stomach clenched. She turned to see the source. Richard Coleman, the factory manager, stood near the entrance, arms crossed, eyes narrow. His gaze swept the room like a predator scenting weakness. And in that instant, she understood. The silence wasn't just fear, it was survival. Richard Coleman was a man molded by years of authority. In his late 50s, he carried the kind of presence that made people instinctively shrink. Broad-shouldered, with a jaw like stone and eyes sharp as a scalpel, he exuded a cold dominance. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, emphasizing the deep lines that power and pride had etched into his face. But it wasn't just his physicality that made Eleanor's pulse tighten. It was his effect on the room. As soon as he stepped onto the factory floor, the energy shifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Movements became sharper, stiffer. No one dared to meet his gaze. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone commanded obedience. He didn't lead with inspiration. He ruled with intimidation. Eleanor had read about people like him before. Middle managers who acted like kings in the corners of companies no one looked too closely at, and men who understood that when people are desperate, fear becomes currency. And Coleman was wealthy in it. She lowered her eyes and moved quickly to her station, trying to blend in. Just another cog, just another name on a tag. But as she reached for her first piece of fabric, a voice, trembling but resolute, rose above the mechanical rhythm. "You cut my hours last week," the woman said. Eleanor turned. It was the woman she had noticed earlier, late 50s, gray streaks threading through her bun, her shoulders permanently bowed from years spent over a machine. Her hands trembled, but her voice fought to stay steady. "I worked full-time, but my paycheck says otherwise." "Maria." Coleman tilted his head slightly, amused. His lips curled into a thin, dangerous smile. "I need that money," Maria insisted, her voice shaking now, fists clenched tightly by her sides. "I earned it." He stepped closer. His voice dropped to a condescending whisper that still managed to carry across the room. "Let me explain something, Maria. I decide what you get paid. If I say you worked 80%, then that's exactly what you worked." Eleanor watched Maria flinch. Coleman leaned in, just enough for only her to hear, but Eleanor could see the betrayal flicker across Maria's face. "If you don't like it," he said, cruel satisfaction lacing every word, "the door's right there." Maria's shoulders collapsed under the weight of defeat. The fire in her eyes dimmed. She didn't argue. She didn't speak. She just stood there, frozen in humiliation. Coleman had won. Again. Eleanor's grip on the fabric at her station tightened until her knuckles turned white. This wasn't just about wages. This was about stripping people of dignity, of power, of the basic right to speak without punishment. The anger she felt wasn't the kind that screamed. It was deeper, colder. It settled like a stone in her gut, heavy and immovable. And if this had been happening under her nose all this time, how many Mariahs had come and gone? How many stories never got told? She wanted to storm across the room, to call him out, to take back control. But if she did that now, it would all be over. Her cover blown, her mission cut short. She needed more than outrage. She needed undeniable proof. So she stayed silent, watching, waiting. In just a few days, the rot within the factory had become impossible to ignore. Eleanor had expected harsh conditions. What she hadn't expected was how carefully the system was built to exploit and discard. Overtime without pay, injuries ignored. People worked to the bone, then quietly pushed out when they couldn't keep up. They were called low-productivity dismissals, but Eleanor knew better. It was punishment. It was cleansing. It was silence, enforced. He saw wrists wrapped in cloth instead of braces, blood blotted from raw fingertips, and still the workers endured. They didn't complain. Not out loud, because here, complaining wasn't just risky, it was dangerous. Each night, Eleanor returned to her small, dimly lit apartment. It was nothing like her penthouse in the city, just a sagging mattress, a cracked mirror, and a rickety table where she scribbled her observations. She wrote until her fingers throbbed, recording every injustice, every name, every detail. Rage burned in her chest, but she buried it. Emotion wouldn't win this war. Evidence would. Then came the knock. It was late, and Eleanor wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door cautiously, and there she was, young, sharp-eyed, and brimming with defiance. Wild, dark curls framed her face, her sleeves rolled up like someone perpetually ready for a fight. "Elena," the woman said, nodding, "thought you might need someone to show you how to survive this place." There was a raw strength in Elena's voice, an energy that was rare in a place like this where hope was usually the first casualty. "You seem to be doing just fine on your own," Eleanor replied, masking her caution. Elena smirked. "Yeah, that's what they think too. That's why Coleman watches me like a hawk." Eleanor stepped back, letting her in. Elena didn't hesitate. "I don't know who you really are," she said, voice low. "But I've been around long enough to spot someone who doesn't belong." Eleanor's breath caught. She had tried to be invisible, to blend, but Elena had seen through her like glass. "I don't know what you mean," Eleanor said evenly. Elena laughed softly. "Relax. I'm not going to out you. I don't care where you came from. What I care about is that you actually seem to give a damn." Eleanor stayed quiet, listening. "There's something you should know," Elena continued. "Coleman, he keeps a record, every lie, every fake payroll change. It's all in a logbook, his little black book of screw-overs." Eleanor's pulse raced. "You're sure it exists?" Elena gave her a look. "I don't say things I'm not sure about." If the book was real, it could be everything. The proof she needed to bring the entire system down. But then came the catch. "It never leaves his office," Elena said, "and he locks it up every night." Eleanor let out a breath. Of course he did. Nothing about this was going to be easy. "I'm in," Elena said simply, standing. "If you want to do something about it." "I'm tired of watching people get crushed." Eleanor watched her, weighing the risk. Bringing Elena in meant doubling the danger, but something in Elena's eyes told her this woman had already been living in the fire. "I'll think about it," she said at last. Elena grinned. "You do that. Just don't think too long." The next day, Eleanor sat alone at one of the rusted metal lunch tables, the wheels of a revolution slowly beginning to turn in her mind. In the break room, Eleanor sat alone, carefully unwrapping the modest sandwich she had packed that morning. The air was filled with quiet murmurs and subdued tension. Workers gathered in small clusters, their voices barely above a whisper. Each conversation clipped, measured, as though even here, behind closed doors, they feared being overheard. It wasn't just about gossip, it was about survival. Then she heard it, a voice that sliced through the background noise like a knife through fabric. Coleman. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. He shifted subtly, just enough to catch a glimpse of him standing near the vending machine. His stance was relaxed, too relaxed. He spoke in low, deliberate tones to a man in a crisp navy suit. Corporate. An executive. Eleanor didn't recognize his face, but the suit said everything. These weren't idle words. They were strategy. She slipped her hand into her pocket, finding the cell phone she had smuggled in. Without even glancing down, she pressed the record button. "Cutting costs is easy," Coleman said, a smug edge in his voice. "You squeeze them, bit by bit. A few hours here, a couple deductions there, nothing they can build a case on." The executive chuckled, clearly entertained. "They never push back," Coleman continued. "They wouldn't dare. The moment one of them even thinks about speaking up, I make an example out of them." Eleanor's jaw clenched so tightly she thought it might crack. She remained motionless, forcing her expression to stay blank, even as rage boiled in her chest. "You'd be surprised how much we've saved the company this quarter," Coleman added, practically gloating. "And the best part, the books are clean. Even if someone tried to dig, they'd find nothing." Her grip on the phone tightened. This was it. Her first solid piece of evidence, spoken in Coleman's own voice, unfiltered, undeniable. But it was also a warning. If he felt this secure in what he was doing, then he had covered every track. It wouldn't be enough. Not yet. And then something shifted. She began to feel it, that cold, creeping suspicion. Coleman's eyes started to linger on her a little too long during shift changes. His indifference turned into calculation. The casual cruelty in his tone became more measured, more directed. She was no longer invisible. Still, she pressed on. The recording was a start, but it wouldn't topple the system. She needed names, numbers, something concrete. Something that no one in corporate could ignore or bury. But she knew Coleman. He was too smart to leave vulnerabilities lying around. He was a man who thrived on control. Every file, every form, every figure meticulously locked away. If he sensed anyone trying to pull at the threads, he'd unravel them before they got close. That morning, as Eleanor settled into her workstation, her body tensed the second she felt a shadow fall over her. "You," Coleman said, voice sharp, like a knife slicing through the air. "Come with me." Around her, a few workers looked up, their eyes flickering with concern, but quickly snapped back to their machines. No one dared acknowledge what was happening. Eleanor looked up, forcing confusion onto her face, even fear. "Did I do something wrong?" He didn't answer. He simply turned and walked toward the office corridor, expecting her to follow. She rose, legs stiff, heart pounding. She had walked into boardrooms with billionaires, negotiated contracts with Fortune 500 giants, but now, under the watchful eye of a man who held all the wrong kind of power, she felt genuinely vulnerable. The office was dimly lit. Blinds half drawn cast harsh lines across the walls, giving the space an almost cinematic eeriness. Filing cabinets loomed like sentinels, and binders were stacked in chaotic order. The factory floor was just beyond the window, but from here it looked like another world. Coleman eased back into his chair, steepling his fingers over his stomach. "You're new," he said. "Emma Clark, right?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." "You don't talk much." "I just try to do my job." she replied quietly. He smiled, but it was hollow. His eyes were calculating, dissecting her like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. That's good. We like people who keep their heads down. She stayed still, waiting. Then he leaned forward, gaze narrowing. Tell me something, Emma. Why do I get the feeling you're paying attention to things that don't concern you? Eleanor forced herself to shrink inward, shoulders drooping. Long, I don't know what you mean. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the desk. I've been doing this a long time. I can spot someone who's just here to make a paycheck, and someone who's digging. She gave a nervous laugh, mimicking the kind of fear she'd seen in the others. I've never worked in a place like this before. I guess I was just trying to understand how it works. His head tilted, measuring her. After a long pause, he leaned back. I'll let this one slide, but I expect my employees to stay in their lane. Understood? Yes, sir, she replied instantly. Good, you can go. She stood, careful to control every movement. As she reached for the door, something caught her eye. A stack of folders, carelessly placed near the edge of his desk. She saw them only for a moment. Names. Red ink. Adjustments. Deductions. Maria. Elena. Others. Each name had been violated by a slash of red. A stolen wage, a cut hour, a silent punishment. Her pulse surged. She burned the details into her memory. Just as she reached the door, she heard it. I'll be watching you. She froze. Slowly she turned. Coleman stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a smirk curving across his lips like a scar. I don't know what it is about you, Emma, he said, but something tells me you're not just here for the paycheck. Eleanor forced a small smile. I just need this job, sir. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Then don't give me a reason to take it away. He shut the door. Eleanor exhaled. Only then did she realize she had been holding her breath. She had come dangerously close to being exposed, and now she knew. Coleman was watching. She walked back to the floor, her heart beat loud in her ears. She was running out of time. The confrontation confirmed everything. This factory wasn't just cutting corners. It was bleeding its workers dry through a system built on intimidation, fear, and silence. She had seen it in reports. Now she saw it in flesh and bone. She needed to act. She found Maria during a short break, seated at the far end of the floor. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Her body language screamed exhaustion and retreat. Maria, Eleanor said gently, her voice soft but firm. Maria flinched and looked up, her eyes guarded. What do you want? Eleanor glanced around. No supervisors nearby. Still, she lowered her voice. I know what they did to you, the hours they cut, the pay they stole. They took the money. You never saw it. Maria's voice trembled with a fierce undertone of survival. Her jaw tensed as she gripped the edge of her apron like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. You don't know anything, she muttered, voice low but laced with a deep-seated fear that came from years of learning when not to speak. Eleanor sat beside her slowly, her voice steady but soft. I know it's not just you. I've seen the lists. Names crossed out, wages cut. This isn't isolated, Maria. It's happening across the floor. Maria's head shook quickly, her breathing growing shallow, her eyes darting toward the security camera mounted near the ceiling. I can't talk about this. Will not, Eleanor pressed gently. Maria exhaled through her nose, her shoulders rigid with tension. Because I need this job. Because if I say the wrong thing, I'm gone. And then I've got nothing. No rent, no food, no options. Eleanor let the silence stretch. It wasn't a silence of awkwardness. It was one of understanding. This was what Coleman counted on, desperation keeping people quiet. "I want to stop this," Eleanor said carefully. "But I can't do it alone. I need proof. Real proof. I know you have something." Maria hesitated. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then, as if fighting with herself, she slowly reached into the deep pocket of her apron. Without looking Eleanor in the eye, she slipped a small, folded piece of paper into her hand. "If you really want to help us," Maria whispered, "find out what this means." Eleanor unfolded it with careful fingers. It was a list. 30 names. Some familiar, others unknown. But what struck her most was the column beside each name. Dates, deductions, wages slashed. Some by just a few dollars, others cut by more than half. At the bottom, a single line written in tidy handwriting. "All records locked in Coleman's office." Her grip tightened. This wasn't a theory anymore. This was a network. A system. And someone had tracked it from the inside. There was more. There had to be. That night, after the last shift ended and the factory lights dimmed, Eleanor found Alina behind the building, near the staff entrance, leaning against the wall with a cigarette poised between her fingers. "Tell me you're not actually going to smoke that," Eleanor muttered as she approached. Alina smirked, not bothering to light it. "Nah, just something to do with my hands when I'm not punching walls." Eleanor handed her the paper. Alina's eyes scanned it quickly. Her usual smirk dropped. Her voice went flat. "Son of a—" She looked up sharply. "So what's the play?" "I need to see what's in that office," Eleanor said, her voice now a mix of resolve and dread. Alina raised an eyebrow, as in, "Get inside?" Eleanor nodded. A slow, dangerous grin spread across Elena's face. "Damn. I thought you were just another scared rabbit. Turns out you've got steel in you." "I don't have a choice." Elena crossed her arms and leaned her head back against the wall. "Okay, let's say we actually pull this off. That office? It's locked down like a damn fortress. Cameras, alarms, files probably rigged to disappear." "I saw the documents today," Eleanor said. "They're not just reports. They're names, exact numbers, proof." Elena exhaled, then pointed to the corner of the building. "There's always one problem. Those security cameras. We're being watched. Always." Eleanor swallowed. She had suspected it, but having it confirmed made her stomach twist. "Then we figure out how to avoid them." Elena stared at her for a long moment, the fight in her slowly returning. "You realize if we're caught, this doesn't end with getting fired. Coleman doesn't just burn bridges, he burns people, their reputations, their lives." Eleanor met her gaze. "Then we don't get caught." Elena chuckled dryly. "That's your plan? Brilliant. It's a start." They stood in silence, the factory humming behind them, distant and cold. Finally, Elena flicked the cigarette to the ground, her voice barely above a whisper. All right, boss, let's burn the bastard." The next night, the factory was a skeleton of its daytime self, empty, echoing, eerie. No machines clattering, no voices buzzing. Only darkness, punctuated by the faint flicker of security flashlights and the low electric hum of overhead lights. Eleanor moved like a shadow, every step measured. Alina beside her, no longer cocky, but precise, focused. The fear was real now, humming under their skin like static. They reached the office building's side entrance. Earlier, they'd studied the cameras, each one sweeping a set arc every 30 seconds. That tiny window of movement, that single sliver of time, was their opening. Elena counted quietly. 3, 2, 1, go. They sprinted, bodies pressed tight to the wall as the camera shifted away. Eleanor's heart thundered in her ears. At the door she pulled out a small key, a favor quietly handed to her by a worker who had risked everything to give her a chance. The door opened. They slipped inside and closed it behind them. The office was quiet, still. It smelled of stale coffee and cold authority. Elena took her post at the hallway corner, keeping watch. Elena moved quickly, scanning shelves and drawers. Then her eyes landed on the far corner of the room. A steel safe, tucked low, under a shelf, heavy, locked. Her stomach turned. "We need the key," she whispered. "No time," Elena replied. "Grab what you can, now." Eleanor opened drawers, heart racing, useless files, receipts, office orders, then payroll sheets. Not summaries, breakdowns, names, wages, deductions, photographic evidence of what she'd suspected from the beginning. She grabbed her phone and began snapping photos, one after another, fingers shaking. This wasn't just about stolen wages anymore. It was about justice, and the question wasn't if they would expose. It was how fast they could move before he destroyed everything, page after page. Eleanor's phone clicked in rapid succession, capturing every damning line of data, the stolen hours, the altered wages, the truth. But then, footsteps. Elena froze. Her eyes went wide. "We've got company," she hissed, her voice barely audible. Adrenaline surged through Eleanor's veins. Her fingers worked in frantic silence, shuffling papers back into place, her breath short and sharp. She shoved the final page into her sleeve, just as the metallic rattle of keys echoed from the hallway. The doorknob turned. Panic slammed through her. Elena grabbed her wrist. "Move!" They darted for the side door, hearts hammering, but just as Eleanor's hand reached the handle, it swung open, forcing her to stumble backward. And there he was, Richard Coleman, standing in the doorway like a warden guarding his vault. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between amusement and suspicion, his gaze slicing through them like a scalpel. He wasn't angry, he was calculating, and worse, curious. "Well," he drawled, stepping forward, "what do we have here?" Eleanor's mind raced. There was no script for this. No prepared lie could cover two workers caught inside a locked office in the dead of night. She forced herself to look frightened, because she was. But she made the fear work for her, wrapping herself in the mask of a panicked employee. "I was just—" "Save it." Coleman cut her off with a dismissive wave. His eyes narrowed on her face, studying her features more intently than ever before. Eleanor's blood ran cold. He wasn't just suspicious. He was starting to recognize her. Beside her, Elena tensed like a coiled spring. Eleanor could feel it. One wrong word and she'd lash out. So Eleanor did what she had to. She lied. "Elena's sick," she said quickly, wrapping an arm around her friend's shoulders. "She said she felt faint and I was trying to find a first aid kit. I didn't know where else to look." Elena groaned on cue, clutching her stomach, playing along with a shaky breath. "Yeah, sorry, it hit all of a sudden." Coleman didn't blink. His stare was too steady, too long. Behind him, a security guard hovered at the edge of the hallway, watching. That, Eleanor realized, was the only reason Coleman hadn't exploded yet. He wouldn't cause a scene in front of a witness. Not yet. Finally, after an excruciating silence, he spoke. "You two should go home." Eleanor nodded, heart pounding. "Yes, sir." "Sorry, sir." He said nothing more, just watched, his eyes burning into the back of her neck as she and Elena walked past him, slow, controlled, as if anything faster might break the illusion. They didn't speak until they were blocks away from the factory. The next morning, the shift started like any other, but everything felt wrong. From the moment Eleanor stepped onto the factory floor, she sensed the change. Coleman's suspicion hadn't faded. It had calcified, hardened into action. Supervisors, once mostly indifferent, now prowled the aisles like watchdogs, watching, listening, judging. The pace of production had doubled overnight. Tasks that were once barely manageable now bordered on torture. Everything was designed to push workers to their breaking point. And Coleman? He wasn't lurking in his office anymore. He was out here, circling like a vulture. And he was watching her. Eleanor kept her head down, her hands moving faster than ever, but the machines had been cranked into overdrive. Sweat beaded on her neck, her shoulders ached. Still, she kept moving. She couldn't give him what he wanted. He was waiting for her to falter, to crack, to confirm his worst suspicion, that she didn't belong. Then, without warning, he was there, standing beside her station. "Emma," he said smoothly, but underneath the calm was something serrated. She looked up, forcing a neutral expression. "Yes, sir? You're new here, right?" "Yes, sir." He glanced down at her work, then back at her. "You're struggling. I'll get faster. Will you?" he murmured, leaning in just slightly. "You know, I've worked with people like you for a long time. I can usually tell which ones make it, and which ones crumble." She met his gaze, her pulse roaring in her ears. "I don't plan on going anywhere," she said quietly. Something flickered in his eyes, amusement, or something colder. "Good," he said. "Let's hope that's true." And with that, he walked away. Eleanor gripped the edge of the table so hard her hands shook. She was being hunted. By lunchtime, exhaustion pressed down on her like a weight. Her muscles ached, her brain throbbed. But the fear, that was sharper than ever. Because now Coleman wasn't just watching her. He was digging. She spotted him near the corner of the room, speaking into a phone, his voice low but urgent. "Need to look into her. Something's off." Her stomach twisted. He was pulling strings, running checks, trying to uncover her real identity before she had time to bring him down. That night, Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, hunched beneath the flickering light of a cheap lamp. The smell of the factory still clung to her. Oil, sweat, desperation. She opened her phone, scrolling through the images she had taken. Wage theft, fraud, dozens of workers robbed blind. But then, something strange. She zoomed in on a particular report. The numbers didn't add up. Large transfers, adjustments, funds redirected to accounts that weren't listed on Carter Apparel's payroll system. And then it hit her. This wasn't just exploitation. It was embezzlement. Coleman was laundering stolen wages, funneling them out of the company through secret accounts. The scale was too big, too structured. This wasn't just him. She stared at the screen, her hands trembling. Someone else was involved. Someone powerful. And then she saw it. A name, buried deep in the transaction history. Mark Reynolds. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Mark Reynolds, the CFO of Carter Apparel, one of the company's most trusted executives, the man who had sat beside her in dozens of boardrooms, smiling, advising, reassuring her that everything was running smoothly. Her blood turned to ice. This went all the way to the top. Mark Reynolds. Just seeing his name beside those illicit transfers made Eleanor's breath hitch. He wasn't some faceless executive. He was high-ranking, polished, a man just below the board of directors, a fixture in every major shareholders' meeting, always immaculately dressed, always delivering figures with a calm confidence that soothed investors and masked the rot beneath. He was the kind of man who shook hands with world leaders and still remembered to send her a handwritten birthday card. And now, here he was, tied to accounts that weren't supposed to exist. It went beyond Coleman. Far beyond. The infection didn't just sit in the factory. It ran all the way to the heart of Carter Apparel's leadership, her father's company. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, pressing her fingers to her temples, the weight of betrayal crashing over her like a wave. For the first time in her life, she felt a rupture so deep it fractured her identity. This wasn't a battle of corporate ethics anymore. This was personal. Her father had built Carter Apparel from nothing but grit and ideals. He believed a business thrived only when its people thrived. You don't build a company, he used to say, you build a family. And Eleanor had fought to preserve that legacy, to make Carter Apparel a model of fairness, of dignity, of something better. But now, that vision was a ghost. Behind closed doors, men like Coleman and Reynolds had turned her father's dream into a machine, soulless, merciless, designed to consume human lives and spit out profit. What once was built on pride had been hollowed into a corporate shell, its heart replaced with greed. She had two choices. She could bury everything she knew, walk away quietly, protect her status, her future, let the illusion of Carter Apparel remain intact. She still had the connections, the reputation. She could salvage it all, or she could burn it to the ground. Eleanor stared at the ceiling of her apartment. The shadows danced across the plaster like ghosts of everything she had once believed in. She already knew the answer. She had known it the moment she saw Maria shrink beneath Coleman's threats. She had known it when she saw Luis vanish, discarded without explanation. She had known it when she watched workers bleed and break for a paycheck that barely covered survival. She couldn't walk away. She wouldn't. She grabbed her notebook, flipping to a clean page. Her hands shook, but her resolve didn't. Step 1. Gather irrefutable evidence. Witnesses, transaction trails, audio, images, enough that even the most ironclad legal defense couldn't make it disappear. Expose Coleman. He was the leverage point, the weak link. If she pushed him, he might crack. Step 3. Take down Reynolds, the architect, the one who had weaponized the company's trust, who had turned compassion into capital. But what Eleanor didn't know was that while she was planning her next move, Coleman was already several steps ahead. Back at the factory, under dim fluorescent lights, Coleman sat at his desk, a printed file open before him. The name, Emma Clark. But the details? Something was wrong. No work history, no verified ID, no previous employment records. She didn't exist. Coleman leaned back, phone in hand, his lips curling into a tight, knowing smile. I need someone to look into a new hire, he said coolly. Something tells me she's not who she claims to be. The next day, Eleanor felt it the second she stepped onto the floor. A subtle but unmistakable shift. The way supervisors glanced at her, not with passive irritation, but with purpose. There was a current of electricity in the air, a shared awareness. They weren't just watching her. They were circling. Every move she made now felt like stepping on glass. If she spoke to the wrong person, lingered in the wrong hallway, asked one question too many, it would be over. And the others felt it too. Workers began avoiding her. Conversations died when she approached. Their eyes darted toward security cameras, then away from her. They weren't just scared for themselves anymore. They were scared of her. And then came the breaking point. Luis, quiet, kind Luis, who had spent over a decade at the factory, disappeared. No warning, no explanation. One moment he was hunched over his machine, the next his station was empty, his tools left behind, like he'd stepped out mid-tack and never returned. Eleanor didn't need to ask what happened. Coleman had sent a message, and Luis had paid the price for talking to her. She clenched her fists, her jaw locked so tightly it hurt. Guilt clawed at her throat. She had tried to be careful, but her mistake had cost someone everything. She wanted to scream, to storm into Coleman's office and throw the files in his face, but she couldn't. Not yet. Because she still didn't have enough. Until Elena showed up at her door. He was late. The factory was quiet except for the distant whir of vacuums from the cleaning crew. Eleanor sat at her desk, surrounded by notes, her mind racing. Then, a knock. She opened the door to find Elena, her eyes sharp, holding up a flash drive. "You're going to want to see this," she said. Inside, Elena plugged her laptop in and opened the file. A spreadsheet appeared, long columns of figures. At first glance, it looked like a payroll document, but then Elena zoomed in. "These aren't just wages," she said. "These are transfers. Funds meant for payroll. Redirected." Eleanor leaned in. "How did you get this?" Elena grinned. "Let's just say the IT guy still owes me for that one time I didn't tell HR about his side hustle." Eleanor scrolled through the data. Most names were unfamiliar, but then her breath caught. Mark Reynolds. She sat back in stunned silence. He had always played the role of the good guy, loyal, dedicated, a legacy man. But now, his name was tied to hidden accounts right alongside Coleman's. "This changes everything," Eleanor whispered. "Yeah," Elena nodded. "He's not just covering for Coleman. He's in on it." It was bigger than Eleanor ever imagined. This wasn't a corrupt manager lining his pockets. This was a corporate operation, millions siphoned under the guise of adjustments. Workers paid less and less while the top siphoned more and more. And Reynolds, he was the mastermind. Eleanor sat there, silent, for a long time. This wasn't about fixing a broken system anymore. It was about dismantling the empire that built it. But a dark thought crept in. If Coleman had figured out her secret, how long before Reynolds did? And when he did, how far would they go to silence her? The answer came faster than she expected. The next morning, she walked into the factory and knew something was wrong. Everyone looked at her, then looked away. Supervisors whispered behind clipboards. And just after lunch, 2 security guards approached her workstation. "Come with us," one said flatly. The room went still. Eleanor stood slowly. Her heart thudded hard, but her face remained calm. No panic, no fear. This was the moment. She walked into Coleman's office and immediately saw the trap. Coleman stood beside his desk, arms folded, but it was the man sitting across from him that made her stomach twist. Mark Reynolds. He looked up with a bored smile, crossing one leg over the other. "Sit," Coleman said. She didn't. He smirked. "Suit yourself." He tapped the folder on his desk. "You were good. I'll give you that. But not good enough." He opened the folder. Employment record. Red ink circled every line. No history, no ID, no background. Coleman's smile widened. "Looks like our dear Emma doesn't exist." And just like that, the game had changed. "Now," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "the only question left is, what exactly do you want?" Eleanor met his eyes. Her voice didn't shake, and she was ready to answer. This was the moment everything led to. Eleanor had rehearsed for countless scenarios, but not this one. Not sitting across from a corporate titan and his enforcer, her true identity exposed and the walls pressing in. She had 2 options. She could lie, claim a clerical error, some bureaucratic oversight, pretend she was just a nervous, low-level worker caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Coleman wasn't a fool. The evidence was too damning. If she denied it now, he'd only dig deeper, and deeper still, until there was nothing left to hide. Or she could go all in. She glanced at Reynolds. Unlike Coleman, he wasn't smirking or seething. He was silent, studying her. That was more terrifying. Because Mark Reynolds wasn't just some factory tyrant. He was corporate. He was the man who knew where every body was buried. He didn't need to shout. He could erase people with a phone call. Eleanor exhaled and lifted her chin. "I think you already know what I want," she said, meeting Coleman's eyes. He laughed, a scoff really, and shook his head. "You've got some nerve." Finally, Reynolds spoke. His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. "Carter Peril has no patience for troublemakers." The way he said it chilled her. There was no threat in his tone, just certainty. And then, another voice cut through the room like a blade. "I think she deserves some answers. Don't you?" Eleanor turned, stunned. In the doorway stood Elena, her shoulders squared, a USB drive dangling from her fingers. Coleman's smirk vanished. She stepped forward, tossing the drive onto the desk. I took the liberty of pulling a few files. Reynolds didn't blink. "And what do you think you've got there?" Elena crossed her arms. "Let's see. Offshore transfers, falsified payroll, redirected employee funds, and, oh, your name, Reynolds." She wasn't talking to Coleman. She was looking straight at the real king behind the curtain. Eleanor caught the flicker in Coleman's face. A twitch in his jaw, the crack of panic widening. Even he hadn't seen this coming. Reynolds remained unreadable. He picked up the USB and turned it over in his hand, like it was just another expense report. "This is impressive," he admitted, "but let me ask you, what do you think happens next?" The room thickened with silence. Coleman was visibly sweating now. But Reynolds, he looked entertained. That was what made him truly dangerous. He wasn't shaken. Not yet. Eleanor had never felt a decision weigh this heavily, but she also had never held so much power in her hands. She stared across at two men who had built their empires on exploitation and fear, who had turned human beings into numbers, who had stolen time, dignity, and decades from people who had no voice to fight back. And now, she had what they feared most, the truth. She pulled the USB closer, her fingers steady. "You both know what's on here," she said, "and you know exactly what it means." Reynolds tilted his head, letting out a short laugh. "You think a flash drive will take me down?" He leaned in, voice cold. "You don't know how the world works. This company doesn't run on loyalty. It runs on control, connections. This," he tapped the drive, "this is a headache, not a downfall." His tone turned sharp. "You're going to walk away, and if you do, you'll still have a career, your reputation, but if you stay in this fight, you'll lose everything." Eleanor didn't flinch. "And if I don't?" Reynolds gave her a slow, patronizing smile. "Then you'll learn what it's like to be powerless." Coleman coughed nervously, sensing how quickly the tables were turning. His voice cracked with urgency. "Look, Eleanor, this doesn't have to get ugly. We can fix this. Let's be reasonable. You want compensation? We'll make it worth your while." Reynolds scoffed, rolling his eyes. Pathetic. Coleman pressed on, ignoring him. "Name your price, whatever you need to let this go." Eleanor's stomach turned. This was how men like them worked. Steal from the poor, pay off the powerful. When caught, throw money at the fire and pray it goes out. But she hadn't come this far to be bought. She glanced toward Elena, silent, strong. She thought of Maria, of Luis, of all the names on those falsified reports. She looked back at Coleman. "Barlin, you think I want your money?" she whispered. He paused. "Everyone wants something." Eleanor leaned forward. I want you gone. The room froze. Then, calmly, she reached for her phone, dialed. 2 rings. Then a voice answered. This is Eleanor Carter, she said clearly. I need you to initiate an immediate internal audit of Carter Apparel. Effective now. Coleman paled. Reynolds raised an eyebrow, but even he couldn't hide the flicker of annoyance behind his calm. You can threaten me, Eleanor continued, locking eyes with Reynolds. But you're not untouchable. Not anymore. Reynolds slowly stood, adjusting his suit jacket. Impressive, he said, that smile returning, but this time it wasn't amusement. It was acknowledgement. Most people wouldn't have made it this far. Coleman, meanwhile, looked ready to unravel. You don't have that kind of power, he sputtered. Eleanor stood tall. You forget who I am, she said. This is my company, and I'm taking it back. Coleman looked genuinely afraid. He wasn't worried about reputation anymore. He was worried about prison. Reynolds, however, remained composed. He watched her for a long moment. Then, with deliberate calm, he buttoned his jacket and walked toward the door. This fight isn't over, he said, pausing at the threshold. You know that, don't you? Eleanor didn't blink. I'm counting on it. Eleanor didn't blink. Her voice was steady steel. I'm counting on it. Reynolds chuckled, amused in that way only the truly powerful can afford to be. He turned to Coleman with casual disdain. Well, he said with a smirk, I'd say it was nice working with you, but let's be honest, you were never that useful to begin with. Coleman flinched, as if struck. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Reynolds simply straightened his jacket, turned to Eleanor, and said, Good luck, Carter. You're going to need it. And just like that, he was gone. Coleman slumped into his chair, the illusion of control slipping from his fingers like dust. His downfall had begun. But Eleanor didn't feel like celebrating. Because if Mark Reynolds wasn't panicking, it meant only one thing: he still had cards left to play. And she knew she hadn't reached the end of the war. Not yet. She stood alone in the dim office, silence humming with tension. Just as she reached for her things, Reynolds' footsteps returned. He walked in, casual, confident, like he'd just remembered a parting gift. You've been busy, digging into my sins, he said smoothly, placing a folder on the desk. But did you ever stop to wonder about your own? Eleanor's pulse quickened. He slid the top page toward her, Carter Apparel's logo stamped proudly across the heading. But it wasn't the logo that froze her. It was the date. More than a decade ago. Her eyes scanned the lines. Withheld wages, unpaid overtime, safety violations, all under one name, her father's. Her breath caught, her heart pounded. It felt like a betrayal deeper than anything Reynolds or Coleman had done, because this one was personal. This wasn't a last-ditch move. This was calculated. She looked up. What is this? Reynolds leaned back against the desk, calm as ever. Proof that your father wasn't the saint you believe he was. She wanted to scream that it was a lie, but the numbers were there. The violations were real. Reynolds tapped the folder. Long before you arrived, this company ran just like every other. Cheap labor, long hours, no oversight. He was a businessman. He just knew how to hide it better. No, Eleanor whispered. That's not who he was. Believe what you like, Reynolds said, voice low. But these documents, these are facts. And when you go public with your story, when you try to tear us down, the media won't stop with us. They'll dig into everything, including your precious legacy. Eleanor clenched her fists. She had come here to expose corruption, to bring down 2 men who had hollowed out Carter Apparel. But now, the rot stretched back to the foundation. If she moved forward, the company might collapse. Thousands of workers could lose their livelihoods, families destroyed. If she stayed silent, she'd be complicit. She stood paralyzed at the edge of two impossible choices. Reynolds knew it. His gaze was cool and measured. "This isn't about me anymore," he said. "This is about Carter Apparel, about everything your father built." He let the silence stretch before asking, "So what are you going to do? Burn it all down?" Eleanor looked at the files again. She had worshipped her father, held his principles close like armor. She believed he had built something honest in a corrupt world, but now that image crumbled. Maybe he hadn't been the man she thought. But she still had a choice. She reached for her phone. Reynolds' smirk faded. "Who are you calling?" he asked, for the first time sounding unsure. She met his gaze. "The press." His expression cracked. "You're bluffing," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Eleanor pressed the call button. "You think I'd protect a lie just to save face?" she said. "If this company is rotten to the core, it needs to fall." The line connected. A voice answered. "This is James Carter, New York Tribune." Eleanor took a deep breath. "I have a story for you." Her phone buzzed. An incoming call interrupted her mid-sentence. The screen flashed with a name: Carter Apparel Board of Directors. Her stomach sank. "They knew." She answered. "Eleanor," said a familiar voice. Arthur Whitman. Calm, controlled, but with that unmistakable undercurrent of menace. "I'm giving you one chance to walk away." She gripped the chair's armrest. "You knew?" "I know many things," he replied. "But if you go through with this, you won't just destroy Reynolds or Coleman. You'll destroy everything your father built. The company, the brand, thousands of jobs, investors, suppliers, families." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "I'm not the one who destroyed it." "This isn't just about two men," Arthur said, voice hardening. "It's about the institution, about legacy." He paused. "Expose this scandal the way you're planning to, and you take down everyone, even the innocent." She closed her eyes. So that was their angle. Weaponize the consequences. Frame truth as destruction. "You're asking me to sacrifice justice to protect a machine built on lies?" Arthur didn't blink. "I'm asking you to think beyond yourself. This is bigger than you." "No," she said. "This is cowardice." There was silence. Then Arthur's voice, colder now. "I was hoping you'd be smarter than this." She laughed bitterly. "Smart, you mean? Complicit. It means knowing when to pick your battles." She began to pace. "And when exactly was I supposed to fight back? When they slashed wages? When they fired Luis for telling the truth? When you watched men like Reynolds steal millions while workers broke themselves on sewing machines?" Arthur's voice turned sharp. "You think your father never compromised? He wasn't a saint. He was a businessman." Eleanor froze. There it was. The final manipulation. Used the memory of her father as both shield and sword. "You think I didn't know?" Arthur pressed. "You think the board hasn't cleaned up worse than this before?" Eleanor sat again, the weight of history pressing against her. But then she thought of Maria, trembling, too afraid to speak. She thought of Luis, gone for standing too close to her. She thought of the workers, the truth. She was her father's daughter, but not his echo. She lifted the phone. "Thank you. I've made my choice." Arthur exhaled, disappointment clear. "Then I can't protect you." The line went dead. Eleanor lowered the phone. She had expected this. She knew the board would try to silence her. But they hadn't succeeded. And now she was ready to finish what she started. Eleanor didn't blink. "I'm counting on it." A dry chuckle came from Reynolds as he looked over at Coleman. "It was nice working with you," he said, tone cold, "but you've never been very useful." Coleman's face went slack. Reynolds straightened his jacket and turned back to Eleanor. "Good luck, Carter. You're going to need it." Then he was gone. Coleman slumped into his chair, defeated. Eleanor didn't celebrate. If Reynolds wasn't shaken, she knew he still held the trump card. This fight was far from over. Where others saw a confrontation ended, she recognized a deeper battle beginning. Her father's legacy now hung in the balance, and Reynolds wasn't done reshaping it. 10. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, placing it on the desk. "You've been busy digging through my sins," he said, voice smooth. "But did you ever stop to wonder about your own?" Eleanor's pulse pounded. She looked at him, heart racing. He slid the folder toward her. The Carter Apparel logo stared back, but the document within was dated 10 years ago. Her breath caught. She skimmed the lines. Unpaid overtime, wage suppression, ignored safety violations. Suspicion formed into certainty. It all bore her father's signature. He leaned back. "These are your father's records." Carter Apparel was no different under him. Profit, not principle, guided it. Eleanor's world shuddered. She had believed in his ideals, only to find the roots were tangled in compromise. Reynolds' voice was calm but laced with intent. "When you go public—" He paused to let the weight sink in. "If you expose me, you'll expose him, and this company could collapse. Thousands of workers, countless families, all collateral." Eleanor's stomach twisted. She could save the company, or reveal the truth. Either path risked tragedy. Reynolds watched her quietly. "So, what will it be? Burn it down." She closed her eyes, remembering Maria, Luis, fear-worn on every stitch of that factory floor, and the whispers of stolen hours and hollow lives. She picked up her phone. Reynolds smirked. "Calling the press?" He sounded surprised for the first time. She ignored him. "Yes." She dialed. "This is James Carter, New York Tribune." "Up to that, I have a story." She started but was cut off by an incoming call. Carter Apparel Board of Directors. Her heart plummeted. "Eleanor," said Arthur Whitman's measured voice, "I'm giving you one chance to walk away." She gripped the chair. "You knew?" "I know many things. But if you do this, you may destroy everything your father built. Jobs, families, investments." She pressed on. "I'm not the one who destroyed it." Arthur's voice softened. "Think of the institution." "But that's cowardice. Smart is choosing your battles. When were we supposed to fight when they stole from our workers?" Silence. "He wasn't a saint," Arthur finally said. "Your father made compromises." Her breath caught. Feeling, "They all do. We cleaned up worse than this." She swallowed, heart heavy but firm. "I've made my choice." Arthur sighed. "Then I can't protect you." Click. Eleanor stared at her phone. She'd braced for opposition, but hearing the board's betrayal still stung. She looked at Elena, who stood by the window, her strength unbroken. "So," Elena said quietly, "what now?" Eleanor set her jaw. "Press conference tonight." Elena blinked. "No heads up? What if the board kills it?" Eleanor started typing. "Once it's out, they can't stuff it back in." Elena grinned, rolling her laptop open. "I'll handle the press. You just get ready to drop the bomb." Eleanor glanced at her phone. An unknown number had texted. "If you continue, you won't just lose the company. You'll lose everything." A chill ran through her. This wasn't the board. This was someone with far more to lose. Power hidden in the shadows. But she wouldn't back down. That evening, the press room buzzed with tension. Cameras lined the front row. Seats held journalists, employees, and shareholders, each wondering how far this would go. Eleanor stepped up to the podium. She had spoken in boardrooms before, but this was different. Today, she wasn't defending profits, she was declaring war. For years, Carter Apparel has claimed it stands for integrity, fairness, and respect, she began, voice steady. But behind that image lies a lie. She placed a thick folder on the podium. Here is undeniable proof that senior executives, Richard Coleman, Mark Reynolds, and Arthur Whitman, engaged in systematic corruption. Camera flashes exploded. She revealed files of wage theft, workers forced to labor under cruel conditions while executives enriched themselves. Next, she said, flipping to hidden transfer records. These documents prove embezzlement, millions siphoned into offshore accounts under the names of executives, including Mark Reynolds. She paused, locking eyes with him, coolly seated at the back. And finally, she said, the board knew. They chose profit over people. Gasps swept the room. I will not allow this to continue. Board members looked at each other, shocked. One older man rose. This is unacceptable, he declared. Richard Coleman is terminated immediately. Coleman, pale and silent, was led out. Reynolds remained seated, adjusting his cufflinks. Quiet the show, he said, voice cool. It's not a show, Eleanor countered. It's justice. Reynolds stood. You think you've won? You can fire me. But the system is unchanged. Her gaze was unwavering. You're right. That's why I'm resigning and bringing in new leadership. She held up another document, a finalized agreement with a social impact investment firm that guarantees worker representation on the board. The room erupted. Reynolds laughed coldly. You're dismantling your father's legacy. No, she replied sharply. I'm saving it. Security escorted Coleman out. Board members whispered. Some looked angry, others shaken. Arthur remained seated, expression unreadable, calculating. Eleanor left the podium, phone buzzing. This isn't over. She knew it. The war had just begun. Within days, Coleman was indicted on fraud and labor charges, his assets frozen. Reynolds resigned amid rumors of cartel funding, but whispers said he'd vanish, only to resurface elsewhere. Arthur stayed, his seat diminished, but his ambition intact. Carter Apparel enacted sweeping reforms, transparent payroll, worker representation, reinstatement of wronged employees. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Eleanor walked through the halls one last time. These polished floors, echoing footsteps of executives, glass walls of power, they were chapters she'd closed. She had lost her title, reputation, even illusions, but not her integrity. At the exit, Maria stood awaiting her. Their eyes met. Maria clasped her hand, voice soft. We won't forget what you did. Eleanor smiled, tears in her eyes. She turned and walked out, into an uncertain future, but true to herself. Her story reminds us true power isn't control, it's responsibility. Eleanor chose justice over legacy, sacrificing everything to confront corruption. It won't vanish overnight, but she started something no one can stop. If you were in her shoes, would you do the same? The battle's never truly over, but it takes courage to begin. Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire and challenge.